Working in child protective services taught me something unexpected. Leadership can be shaped by silence. When the system trains you to keep your head down, follow directives without question, and investigate families even when the evidence isn't there, your leadership voice slowly collapses inward. You learn to comply, not to question, to perform, not to lead. Over the years, while becoming clinically licensed, growing as a certified herbalist, and now deepening my practice through doctoral studies, I've come to understand that true leadership requires intentional reflection. Reflection is not just a personal experience, it's a professional responsibility. It forces us to ask what shaped us, what silenced us, and what transformed us. As I reflect on my leadership, I can see clearly the ways in which my previous training, especially during my time at CPS, conflicted with decolonized supervisory practices and anti-carceral leadership, models we studied. Those tensions and the shifts that came from examining them are central to my leadership evolution and how I examine my leadership voice. This reflection is both an academic analysis and an honest reckoning. It speaks to how I've reclaimed my leadership voice by returning to culturally grounded wisdom. As I reflect on leadership, I realized that much of what I learned in CPS wasn't leadership, it was conditioning. I have been shaped by a system that rewarded silence, discouraged questioning, and treated compliance as competence. That environment asked me to disconnect from intuition, clinical judgment, and cultural wisdom that should have guided my practice. It clarified that leadership is not about following a hierarchy. It's about thinking critically and recognizing when decisions are being shaped by fear, bias, or incomplete evidence. It also affirmed that leadership philosophy I began developing in 701 and expanded in my 705 manifesto, leadership that is earth-connected, community-rooted, anti-racist, and grounded in ancestral wisdom. Now I understand that supervision as a culturally led space where power must be examined openly and where evidence is interpreted through context, not detached from it. Instead of training compliant workers, supervision should cultivate reflective practitioners who can recognize when systems are causing harm. As I've learned, one of the clearest lessons I've learned is that leadership is never neutral. Every supervisory decision reflects the values we hold and the assumptions we bring into the room. And I understand how essential it is to lead with cultural consciousness and power awareness. A major shift in my voice came from naming epistemic injustice and how the knowledge of Black families, mothers, and even frontline workers is often devalued in favor of lab results or policies treated as absolute truth. Recognizing that pattern helped me see that supervision must be more than protocol. It must honor lived experience and question dominant interpretations. Reflective supervision also shaped my leadership. Instead of defaulting to quick conclusions, I now pause and ask, what is the context? Whose interpretation is driving the decision? And is this response rooted in safety or in bias? This aligns with research showing that culturally responsive practices requires integrating culture into clinical judgment, not creating it as background. Finally, I've embraced that my leadership is inherently anti-carceral, and I now name racism, policy violence, and institutional harms openly. And I lead with a commitment to reduce punitive responses that have little to do with safety. One of the clearest examples of unjust supervision from my time in CPS involved the families I investigated for newborn toxicology, positive toxicology of cannabis in their meconium. Nearly every infant was healthy, the mother was stable and supported, and the reported source would have no safety concerns. In one case, the test and the report to CPS was ordered by a charge nurse who overheard a mother mentioning eating an edible early in her pregnancy when she was out of the country, before she even knew she was pregnant. And that charge nurse pressured the social worker to report or face retaliation. That was not safety, it was punitive. This pattern was common, so one day during supervision, I provided research to my supervisor showing that most cannabis-positive newborns had no indicators of harm besides the lab results itself. Yet my supervisor instructed me to act as though the presence of THC itself constituted as danger, and to focus my energy on the federally funded regulations while ignoring context and scientific limitations of meconium testing. This demonstrated how easily Black families can be pulled into CPS due to bias, misinformation, and systematic racism rather than legitimate safety concerns. In order to rework the scenario through a decolonized and trauma-conscious lens, I had to step back and ask deeper questions that go beyond policy checklists and challenge the assumptions that shape the original decision. Two critical questions emerged for me. First, what are the biological and temporal limitations of meconium testing for determining immediacy of exposure, impairment, or neglect? And second, What might a supervisory or managerial approach be reworked to consider factors beyond the positive test results, such as maternal intent, cultural context, and actual level of risk to the child? This question matters because it exposes how easy toxicology can be misinterpreted, weaponized, and particularly against Black mothers. International research challenges the assumptions that a cannabis-positive meconium test proves harm or neglect. Meconium requests exposure across months throughout the entire pregnancy and cannot determine timing, intention, impairment, active use, or actual harm. A JAMA-affiliated Jamaican study found no needed or harm among babies exposed to cannabis in utero and even noted enhanced automatic stability at 1 month. Large Canadian reviews report no consistent differences in infants' development or early cognition outcomes once poverty, tobacco exposure are controlled. Clinical chemistry research also confirms that meconium can be affected by contamination, specimen handling, and timing. Taken together, the science shows that a positive test alone doesn't have established danger. This question invites a leadership shift from punitive interpretations to reflective, culturally aware decision-making that honors context and evidence rather than fear and bias. Given these limitations, supervision must rely on contextual, culturally informed judgment rather than punitive systems. Studies from Jamaica, Canada, and the UK show that prenatal cannabis findings are heterogeneous and heavily confounded, which many outcomes driven by the socioeconomic stressors, tobacco, co-use, or structural disadvantages rather than the cannabis itself. Several longitudinal international studies report no developmental deficits when exposure is occasional or the exposure ended early in pregnancy. These findings reinforce that risk assessments must consider maternal stability, support, and intent rather than treating toxicology as conclusive evidence of danger. Applied to supervision, this means evaluating risk through a full contextual lens, engaging families in dialogue, and centering cultural humility. A decolonized supervisory approach recognizes that cannabis use, especially in jurisdictions where it is legal, must not automatically equate with danger. Positive meconium screening alone should not justify CPS involvement. Toxicology must be interpreted within context and not weaponized against families. Taken together, current studies and research makes it clear that a cannabis-positive meconium result cannot be treated as an automatic evidence of neglect or danger. As a clinician and emerging supervisor grounded in decolonized, trauma-conscious leadership, I reject punitive interpretations that rely solely on toxicology. Instead, risk assessments must be contextual, culturally informed, and rooted in respect for maternal autonomy. This approach reflects a leadership stance guided by justice, evidence, and cultural humility. If I were responding to the scenario today, my approach would be fundamentally different. With a decolonized, trauma-conscious leadership lens and a clear understanding of meconium toxicology, I would rely on evidence, not fear or governmental hierarchy. The newborn was healthy, the mother was stable, and the research confirms meconium cannot determine impairment or danger, nor does a positive cannabis screening reliably predict poor outcomes. In DC, where cannabis is legal, the mere presence of THC alone cannot constitute neglect. Besides simply documenting the nurse's retaliation and the coercion of the reporting source, I would elevate this to the nursing leadership and the state board. Misuse of mandated reporting in itself is a form of harm. Rather than accepting my supervisor directive, I would advocate using DPAR principles and research evidence, naming the racial bias and absence of clinical indicators. My supervisory decision would be to close the referral with no action and no further investigation, document the lack of evidence and underlying bias. Beyond the case, my advocacy will continue through policy concerns, education of hospital staff, and efforts to reduce racialized misuse of toxicology. As an herbalist and clinician, I would center education, not punishment, through community workshops and culturally rooted guidance. Those actions will reflect the leader I am now, someone who grounds decisions in science, context, and cultural understanding, who confronts bias directly, and who uses supervision to prevent harm rather than reinforce it. Growth as a leader means being open to reflection, and as I reflect on the case and those like it, I've learned that justice-centered leadership is not defined by obedience. It's defined by discernment. Compliance is often mistaken for professionalism, but neutrality in the face of harm is participation in that very harm. I now understand that ethical leadership requires both resistance and reflection. Resistance to practices rooted in bias or misinformation, and reflection to determine whose knowledge we privilege and what assumptions guide our decisions. Together, these practices form the foundation of accountable leadership. Reworking the scenario made one truth clear. Leadership is not blind compliance. It is the willingness to ask, is this decision just, evidence-based, or culturally grounded? When it's not, it is our responsibility to intervene. Sometimes the most ethical act is to say, no, this does cause harm. That refusal is more than rebellion. It is protection and integrity.